Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back to my channel and another set of videos for you today in my ongoing series where first I do a reading of one of my poems and then I make a second video, which is this one, where I talk a little bit about it, and it could be background, inspiration, it could be poetic devices, imagery used, etc., things to do with the technicalities of writing a poem. It could be different interpretations of it. So, an important note, by the way, if you are one of the people like myself who like not knowing what anyone else thinks about a poem or a piece of art or whatever it is before you experience it for yourself and make up your own mind, then this is going to be your spoiler alert, because then I wouldn't recommend watching this video until you actually have read the poem properly a few times, thought a bit about it. What do you think? What do you feel when you read it? And then you can watch this later and see, oh, yeah, okay, that's sort of the same thing I thought, and oh, that's so different to what I had in mind when I read it. You can do both. One of the wonderful things about poetry and art in general is that there is no right answer for what it means. It has potential meanings, and it's up to each individual person experiencing it to decide for themselves how they feel about it, what it makes them think about, etc. So, and then the third part of this three video set is going to be a song with this poem used as lyrics, and there will be one today as well. So, today's poem is called Tonight, and it is one of two poems in my collection called Three Words, where I use the phrase three words, which I had a certain intention of meaning when I wrote it, but I realized also that it was ambiguous. So I'm going to go back to that a little bit, because this whole poem actually has a certain ambivalence to it that I really, really like. Because if you read this poem, it feels very much like a poem that is a lament for the dead. I feel you are grieving over somebody you loved very, very deeply that has died. But also, it can be, and of course, the ambiguity comes in towards the end, where it might also be that somebody has left you in a more concrete way, not just metaphorically speaking by dying, but by a sudden and unexpected breakup. And I wanted to keep both of those meanings as possibilities in here. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that was to connect those two kinds of grief, because in many ways the grief for lost love is very similar to the grief of someone you love dying. Because both can feel very final, like this is absolutely the end. They can be something that is triggered when you still love someone really deeply, and that love hasn't gone away. It's just the person, the object of your love, that has gone away with a kind of finality that leads you into grief, sorrow, sometimes regret, and feeling that the world has pretty much ended for you. And I really wanted to tie those things together by creating a little bit ambiguity in what we're talking about in this poem, because there is imagery in this poem that is very specifically geared towards death. So the word dying is there, and you have also birds singing a dirge, which is a sort of a song, a lament for the dead. Um, so it really is just the last verse that distinctly introduces the idea more clearly that it may not be somebody who's dead, but it might still be. So stylistically, this poem is very similar to many of my other poems in that it is a lyrical poem. It has a regular rhythm pattern, but most of my poetry that is lyrical uses perfect rhymes. So when you have rhyming words at the end of lines. Usually it's lines 2 and 4 of each verse, but sometimes it can be 1 and 3, 2 and 4 as well, and some other rhyme schemes I use as well regularly. It depends on what it feels like. And sometimes, of course, I like mixing things up a little bit. Um, this one does not have perfect rhymes, but apart from the last verse has a perfect rhyme, but the other ones have half rhymes. And this was a very specific choice, something I wanted to do because I wanted to give it a slightly different feel. There is something that isn't quite right. Um, you don't have, when you are grieving, you don't necessarily have the composure to you are lost to composure, you're out of harmony, your life doesn't rhyme, but of course you're still trying to find back to something. That's part of grieving, is to get past something traumatic, emotionally traumatic to you. So I wanted to include a hint of that in the poem simply by using half rhymes and then ending on a perfect rhyme, just to it rounds things off better linguistically. So for the first verse, it's a very weak half rhyme: stars and goodbye. So they have a goodbye, stars, not quite as goodbye is a diphthong, but stars is not, but it's still a very similar sound. Mine and sky. See, that's still the same sound as goodbye. So, but of course, mine doesn't quite rhyme with sky. Sky rhymes with goodbye. So, of course, there you have this connection as well between verse 1 and 2. And then you have dirge and hers. So you have the same vowel quality again. And then, of course, in the end, it's moan and alone. So it's not those sort of strong perfect rhymes all the way through, but I believe actually in this case and in many cases it actually creates a stronger composition, and the effect of the rhyme when it comes is much stronger because it's like you've been preparing for it with the half rhymes. You've been warming the reader up to it. You've been creating an expectation of lyricality in the way the language is written. Um, what else is there to say about this poem? So yeah, I think this poem, although I can't remember specifically now, I think this poem started as me going for a walk with a dog. And of course, one of the nice things about having a dog that needs to go for walks is that, and this was around the time that I used to write a lot of poetry when I was about 20. So, and one of the great things about walking a dog is you have to go out in any kind of weather, any time of year, and then suddenly it might be a really beautiful day or beautiful night that you go for this walk. And I remember often getting quite inspired by my feeling of nature when I was out on these walks with the dog. I used to take a little circuit on a very quiet road, and in winter it would be really dark, and of course in autumn as well. And I can imagine when I see this poem now that there was one time in winter I would be walking out, I was past a little lake, and it might be winter, a really crisp, dry winter day, winter night, and the full moon would be out, and it would be so clear you could also see all the stars, and it would look a bit like the stars were tears falling from the moon. And I would bring out my notebook and write down, tonight even the moon is crying her tears, the distant stars. And then I would go back and read and write something more about that later. So I can imagine myself doing that, and I think that is quite possibly the origin story of the beginning of this poem. And once I got that line, it was not very far off from doing the second line, because in this particular place where I would stop and it would be very quiet and I could see the moon, there were also lots of trees, and if there was even a hint of a breeze, because of the quiet, you could actually hear the sound of the wind moving through the trees. So I did, and listened, solemnly sigh the treetops to give their last goodbye. And of course, by then I knew this poem would be about some kind of bereavement, whether it's emotional or somebody dying, somebody leaving you. Similar thing, really, both emotional bereavements. And at some point, I would have continued this. The night when even her light is dying, each tear she sheds is mine. And of course, I've already very specifically used the female pronoun for the moon here, which is something that is quite common in poetry. But another good thing about it is that I also wanted to do that on purpose to introduce a slight ambiguity about sometimes in the poem whether the she that you talk about is the moon or the person that the protagonist of the poem, the first person singular, is grieving for. I wanted to create that ambiguity. That could mean the moon, it could mean the girl or the woman that the protagonist is grieving for, or that he has lost, and it could be both at the same time. So knowing nothing is ours tomorrow, no songs, no starlit skies. So of course that sort of no starlit sky is quite extreme, but of course it's that sense of there being nothing left when somebody has left you, when you had really strong emotions that have not waned in any way before the person leaves. And then I do more of that, the imagery that alludes to death again and to funerals. Laments drift in the wind's weak whisper. 1,000 birds sing so dim a dirge. Of course, dirges and laments, basically the same kind of thing. It's like a song for the dead. And of course, it could be for a dead person, but of course, metaphorically, it could be for the death of a relationship, for emotion, for the strong love that you felt for someone. The night is gone with thoughts of sorrow, all for when my love was hers. So I'm using past tense there actually, so as if the love is past. So you get the impression then that, of course, this person has already left the protagonist in the past. And of course, you easily imagine that the protagonist of the poem still has love for this person, but the person herself no longer has because she has left or she is dead. So she's left in some kind of way. And then we get 3 words, words that are softly spoken above the wind's pained moan. And what are the 3 words? And this is also one I quite like because from this, and I'll just read the rest of the verse, cannot calm the fordless flood of tears when she leaves and I stand there alone. And now it's in the present tense again. And now there are several possibilities. First of all, what are the 3 words? And they could be different things, but you also get the impression that even though the protagonist had someone's love in the past, and now we're in the present tense, as if we are reimagining or experiencing a breakup scene. But this is also something that could just entirely be in the mind of the person that is telling this story, this narrative, this first person singular. He could be imagining having a flashback to the time of the breakup or the last words said between himself and the person that is breaking up with him, or that is otherwise leaving him in some kind of emotionally traumatic way. And the 3 words, my first thought when I wrote it was, of course, that the final words of a relationship and a breakup that feels final but that would hurt the most in many ways would be for someone to say I love you and then leave for the last time. So that's what I envisioned first of all. But it could also be other things, so I'm going to leave that open to interpretation for you. But I think maybe in many ways that would be the most powerful emotionally triggering way to leave someone. And of course, if somebody is dead and your strongest memory of them, and of course what triggers your grief is your strong love for them, then of course the three words you may recollect the best might be the last time they said I love you. But, and this is also very important, I think, is if somebody left you with words other than that. For instance, somebody leaves you and then they die with something unresolved. Like you have a fight, somebody rushes out of the house, they slam the door, and they run off, and they run into the road, and they get hit by a car, and then they die. Then the last few words said might be something that will trigger a different kind of grief again, because now you have the feeling of guilt and unresolved conflict that is going to potentially haunt you for the rest of your life, because you will also feel that whatever negative emotions, even though they were just momentary, that caused that to happen is going to mean that it was your fault, you who are left behind, whose fault it is that the person you loved died. So, so that's another interpretation that I think makes it quite interesting, and also, and of course, this is something that one shouldn't be too shy about mentioning in this context. So you have a breakup, you have somebody dying, but of course somebody dying could be different things as well. And I think perhaps a way of dying that most triggers emotional trauma and grief potentially, because it can be really sudden and quite abrupt and also cause a lot of guilt, is suicide. So I think it's worth mentioning that if you imagine the three words to be the final three words somebody says before they go and commit suicide, in many ways it doesn't matter what those three words are, because whatever they are, you are going to interpret them to death and give them a significance that they may not even have because of what comes next. So this is, I think, in many ways, one of my, I would say it is my best poem about a breakup, and also my best poem about death, both at the same time. And it's one of those that I don't think I actually worked very hard at writing this. I think it came quite easily to me when I was working on it back in 1994. This would have been winter 94, so it could be end of year 94, beginning of 95 possibly, but it definitely was during the winter, I think. And at the time I wasn't in the middle of a breakup or anything like that. I wasn't necessarily romantically happy in any kind of way, but I wasn't unhappy, I don't think, when I was writing this. Which in one way made it easier to write about, I think, because any kind of emotion I'd had that could have triggered the ideas and the words and the feelings of the poem were at such a distance when I was writing it. I mean, it was very easy for me to bring back into my mind, but it was at such a distance it was easier for me, I think, to express them. So whether it was about my failed love for a person I was deeply in love with in May 1994, or whether it was a sort of slightly belated reaction to my mother's death the year before again, I don't actually know. But when I wrote it, I certainly had a kind of objective distance to it that in one way made it easier for me to express this kind of feeling that I'd been very close to feeling myself at several points. So I don't know if there's anything else I want to say about it. We do have some alliteration in here that is deliberate, of course. I do like a bit of alliteration. So Solemnly Sigh, there is Dimmer Dirge, and Fordless Flood, things like that. And these are, I like creating some alliteration in my poetry. It actually is something that adds a lot more lyricality and poeticness than rhymes can often do. So I can't think of anything else I wanted to say about this right now. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to shape your opinions of it too much, or give too much away for those who want to spend some time working on experiencing poetry all on their own, and seeing how it makes them feel and think, which is the essence of it. But so if you want to support my channel, if you enjoy my poetry, of course, there are poetry collections that you can buy if you want to support my channel, available on Amazon, links in the description. This one is from 3 Words, as mentioned earlier, but also have 1994 and Breaths of Time available. And of course there are the other ways of supporting my channel, just as simple as liking, commenting, subscribing, and of course there's Patreon, buy me a coffee, buying pictures on pixels.com, buying music on Bandcamp. So all kinds of ways to support my channel that otherwise is unmonetized. There's no advert on my channel, there's no adverts, there's no sponsorship, so everything is self-financed, or whatever generous contributions people like you make by joining me on Patreon or buying any of my things. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. And yeah, goodbye for now. Bye bye.